Okay, I think it's recording. Yes, it tells me it is now. Welcome everybody to another Reading Online Sport Economics seminar. Very pleased to have Ian Gregory-Smith from the University of Sheffield speaking today. I don't have your title to hand in, but I know that it's on the NFL. But I'm going to allow you to share your screen in just a few moments and give us the full title and take away this work that's with co-authors, some of whom are on the call to handle all of Ian's tough questions. Before letting Ian loose, I just wanted to explain my background here, which is a background that was put together this time last year. Because this time last year would have been the Cork Sport Economics Conference organised by Robbie and David Butler. Last year, of course, it didn't happen because of COVID. This year, it's back and it's taking place online virtually next Friday. There's a stellar lineup. And I'm certainly looking forward to it, apart from my own talk, that is. If you do want to get more information, I'll stick a link into the chat, and you can find information on Twitter as well and on their website about the conference. But without any further ado, Ian, please do take away your so far untitled talk.
Okay, so I'll try and share my slides as we tried before, so hopefully this works. So I should be sharing now, so hopefully you can see that. Is it coming?
I'll tell you in a second. Yes, perfect.
Okay, so thanks very much, James. I think I've said it before, but having these seminars on a regular basis on a Friday during the pandemic has definitely been a source of relief for myself and I'm sure many other people. So thanks again. And I hope everybody enjoys the presentation. This paper, as James was saying, it's on the NFL. It's a labour economics paper and it's looking at discrimination. So the rather clickbaity title is Discrimination and Lost Earnings in the NFL. That might be an overstatement. We will see as we go along. So I'm at Sheffield. The co-authors on the paper, we have Alex Bryson and Rafael Gomez, who I'm sure many of you know. Alex is at UCL Institute of Education and Rafael is at the University of Toronto. So this is where we're starting. So I think it's fairly uncontroversial to state that if we look at the evolution of wages over the course of most people's careers, they don't follow the classic labour market model where wages equal marginal revenue product. And this is because there are discontinuities. There are sudden, sharp changes in your earnings over time. So there are big moments in your career where things change. So this could be something like where you graduated. You know, did you get a first, or you were on a 2-1 or a 2-2? Did you get that promotion? Were you made redundant at some point in your career? Did you pick up a bad injury that stopped you working? If we're thinking about the corporate sector, were you involved in a merger and acquisition? All these things, these can matter a lot for career earnings. So we had the thought, well, what if discrimination then plays a role in these big moments? And our feeling is that if it does, then our standard cross-sectional approaches to having a look at wage outcomes when we estimate wage gaps, they may tend to underestimate the role of discrimination if we're not accounting for the process that leads up to these big moments. So as a motivating example, think about the market for CEO wages. So if you've done work in this area, you will know that there are very, quite sizable raw differences in earnings and CEO earnings between men and women, between CEOs of different minorities. Those wage gaps are quite sizable. But when you take a regression-based approach and you control for a good set of observables, such as the actual job they're doing and in the size of the company that they're in and how they've performed over the last couple of years, then those gaps typically go to zero. So often we're led towards the conclusion that that there isn't robust evidence for a wage gap once you've controlled for everything. But of course, at the same time, we know that CEOs from minority groups are vastly underrepresented in the population of CEOs. And it's quite possible that discrimination plays a role in this process to some extent. So if you think about the ex-ante value of the prospect when you're starting out, then it's much lower. So although the observable wage distribution is the same conditionable upon observables, the fact that you have much less chance of making it to the top in the first place means that from the outset, the value of the prospect of that CEO job is lower. So that's the kind of line of thinking we're taking with this paper with NFL players. And the way it goes is like this. So we have pre-labor market observables, so how they performed in college. And the first big selection event that these players face is when they go out of college and they're invited to the combine, which is the place where they get tested before they get drafted into the league. And so we want to know whether race plays a role in this big selection event at the combine. We've got information on players who are successful and information on players who are not successful in the draft. So we'll have a look there. And then they enter the league and they play for usually 4 years. And then they become free agents. So out of the draft, you get drafted into a team. You don't have much choice in the process. But after 4 years, your contract's up and you are a free agent. And so it's in free agency where you can earn the market rate for your talent as an NFL player. And we'll see that that is associated with a very, very large increase in your wages at that point. So that's great if you can survive that long, but of course, a lot of people don't. And in this paper, we're particularly interested in whether race is going to play a role in that survival to free agency, and whether there's a difference between black and white quarterbacks in particular in how they survive to free agency, if they make it or not. So I'll give you some preliminary results, and I should definitely stress that these are very preliminary. So this is a bit of a warts and all presentation, and we definitely have more work to do, and you'll see that when we come to the end. But this is what we have so far. So coming out of the data straight away, the first thing that we'll see is a very large pre-draft selection process into the positions that NFL players play that is along racial lines. And when we're talking about race in this paper, we're talking about skin color. So this is mostly the difference between players in the NFL who look black and players in the NFL who look white. And we have a few players that are non-black and non-white. So there are these raw black-white differences in drafting that are very apparent, but when we account for a full set of observable controls, these black-white differences in drafting are not robust. So they're not significantly different once we control for everything that the people who are hiring these players can also observe about them. So then we move on to wages, and we have a look at the differences in wages, and we'll see that drafting, where you draft, is really critical for your rookie earnings, so those earnings in the first 4 years of your contract. And there's no evidence of wage discrimination at this stage, and we probably wouldn't expect there to be, because the wages that you earn in your rookie contract, they're largely mechanically driven by what the rules are surrounding each year of the draft. We do see this big uptick in wages at the moment of free agency, and when we look at career earnings overall, again, we observe, once we control for everything, that the observed wage distributions are very similar between white and black players. But we do observe some differences in survival rates for quarterbacks in particular. And yeah, this implies the ex-ante option value of the quarterback's career is somewhat lower for black players, but with the important caveat that we need to do more work to establish that this result is robust, and we need to think carefully about the identification as well. Okay, so some further context about the NFL and discrimination in particular. So we have strong priors that there's certainly a historical legacy of racial discrimination in the NFL, and this is uncontroversial. So in the early years of the NFL, black players were just simply excluded from playing. There were some exceptions, but for a relatively long time of people playing football, American football, black players just weren't playing. There were no black coaches between 1920 and 1989. There was a black quarterback in 1920 who also did some coaching, called Fritz Pollard, but again, an exception. And then there was no subsequent black coaches until 89, and there were no black quarterbacks until as late as 1968. About the draft in particular, we have strong historical evidence from case studies of racial discrimination in the draft itself. And I think the best evidence for this, other than just the case studies of the individual players and their testimonies, is that if you have a look at the Hall of Fame, so these are the players who sort of legendary status players in the NFL, who, players who, some of the best players who've ever played the game. Many of the black Hall of Fame players, they went undrafted, and the NFL.com, they have a team of their all-time undrafted team, and 21 out of 24 of those players are black, and the three that are not black, one's a kicker and one's a punter, and almost all kickers and punters in the NFL are white. And there is also Kurt Warner, who's an interesting story. You might want to go read up about him. He's the 1 in a million player who is undrafted and kind of disappears from the league for 4 years, only to come back and have a heroic charge to the Super Bowl and actually win it. So he's somewhat of an exception. Moving forward to sort of more modern background, you will know, I'm sure, of the case of Colin Kaepernick in 2016. So he was the first black quarterback to do the Take a Knee protest in response to police brutality in the United States. And in 2016, he went unsigned as a free agent. So prior to these years, Colin Kaepernick was a starting quarterback for the 49ers. Then he got benched. Then he had a few injuries, and by 2016, he wasn't going to get re-signed by the 49ers. And he went into free agency and he didn't get signed, despite having pretty good overall stats. You'd think that you're just taking his stats at face value, you'd probably think that he would be able to get a spot in an NFL team, maybe not as a starter, but probably as a backup. But nobody took him, and he alleged that he was essentially blackballed by the owners, that there was a conspiracy amongst the owners not to sign him because of the protest that he had led. He settled that lawsuit in 2019. And still, black quarterbacks, they remain underrepresented in our sample of players. And there is a caveat to that, though, that the sample of our players, it runs to 2018. And there is a very new wave of recent, very high quality quarterbacks coming out of the draft. The most famous of which at the moment is Patrick Mahomes, who's now the highest paid quarterback. But these other quarterbacks here, Jackson, Watson, Murray, Prescott, they're all high earners. They're all high caliber black quarterbacks. So, yeah, maybe the stereotypes associating with black quarterbacks are going to be eroded in the future when we see these fantastic players play out their careers. So thinking more about the economics then, and I'll be quite brief here, just think briefly about the economics of discrimination, what the underlying theories associated with discrimination in the economics literature. Why would we have discrimination in this labour market? The first you may be aware of is this idea of taste-based discrimination that goes back all the way to Becker, and that's just simple prejudice there, that you pay black players less because you don't like them. Statistical discrimination is somewhat different from that. There's no prejudice involved. There's no sort of distaste of black players. It's the idea. It's this rational judgment that you're receiving a noisy signal. So you're receiving a noisy signal like the player's performance in college, and then you're updating your judgment based on the group average that you see perform in the league. So there's no prejudice, it's just rational judgment. You're using the group average to supplement your noisy signal, but if the group average performs worse for one group than the other, then that's going to not favour people from that particular group. More recently, we've had literature published on stereotypes, and you can view this as statistical discrimination, but instead of the judgment being rational, the judgment is somewhat irrational. It's based on a bias, it's based on a stereotype, and this can lead to some interesting results like discrimination reversal. So once you see these biases unwind, you might actually reverse the discrimination. Other thing to note that in the recent Journal of Economic Perspectives paper by Small and Pager, they say that there's no sort of formal theory of what we see a lot of in the press at the moment about institutional discrimination. So perhaps people are working on it at the moment, but yeah, we can't really think about institutional discrimination in this context because there's not really a formal economic theory of it to pin it back to. But maybe in the future, some clever people are working on this at the moment. Okay, so the interesting thing about prejudice is that in sort of famously, this can be competed away under certain sort of restrictive assumptions, in particular, perfect competition, that you would expect discrimination to be competed away because you're paying a price. You are overpaying one group at the expense of another group. Interesting setting about the NFL, though, is that there are explicit competitive balancing mechanisms. So there are these things that will resist the natural tendency of discrimination to be competed away. We have things like the draft going to the weakest teams, the best picks going to the weakest teams in the draft. We have revenue sharing. We have these restrictive contracts. We have salary caps in the NFL. So these mechanisms designed to promote competitive balance may also have this unintended consequence of resisting the competitive forces that might otherwise compete away discrimination. The other thing that we have in the NFL, and this is going back all the way to a paper in '92, is customer-led, or the potential for customer-led discrimination, which is where NFL fans, they may be willing to pay for their prejudices. They may be willing to overpay a quarterback from one group and underpay a quarterback from another group, and just suffer the negative competitive consequences of that. And that customer-led discrimination has been observed elsewhere in other non-sporting settings. And there's a paper by Lang and Spritzer in the Journal of Economics Perspectives that I'd refer you to. In terms of statistical discrimination, this is how I sort of originally thought of the problem. This was the one that was most, I guess, comes most naturally to economists. We see the franchise selectors receiving this noisy signal. We see them observing the college stats, the physical stats of the combine. And this gives a signal about how likely this player is going to perform in the NFL. It's a signal about their future productivity. And then perhaps the franchise selectors also use the group averages of players who've played in the NFL to supplement that noisy signal. This has the potential to persist with profit maximizing franchises because they're trying to do this optimally. Biased belief one, so why might the perceptions of that group average be incorrect? Well, we know, as we've seen already, that stereotypes were widely held in the past about black players in the NFL. And some of these have persisted to the modern day. So this is a quote from Michael Vick, who was a very good black quarterback. And this quote is representative of a view, which is that black quarterbacks are sort of undervalued for their ability. They're viewed more as athletes, as like the other players in the NFL are. and perhaps they're undervalued when it comes to things like passing ability. To note that these stereotypes can also work in the other direction, it's true. So when I was growing up, there was a film called, well, it's about basketball, called White Men Can't Jump. And that sentiment, I think, is still there in the NFL. And we'll see in a moment that there are actually no white cornerbacks operating in the league in 2019, and very, very few in the entire sample. In terms of qualitative evidence that we've had on this already, so we know that from interviews with players who've been through the draft process that whilst they don't report overt racism, sort of these sort of racial stereotypes, that black players are more athletic, white players make better decisions, these things seem to show up in qualitative interviews with players who've been through the process. And they also tend to show up in things like textual analysis, where people put the words that reporters write about players, different players who are white, different players who are black, and again, the same sort of the wordings associate. So you associate athleticism with black players, you associate good decision making with white players. These things come out of textual analysis of media reports as well. So yeah, so we have strong prize to think that we might likely find some effects to do with discrimination. We're certainly not the first to have a look at discrimination in the NFL, so there has been quantitative evidence on this. So Berry and Simmons find evidence that rushing black quarterbacks have been undervalued in the past. Kiefer, looking at linebackers, find that black linebackers are paid less despite getting more game time. So those two observations are at odds with each other. And Volts in the JSC in 2017 show that black quarterbacks are more likely to get benched, controlling for a whole bunch of things. But it's not unanimous. There is papers that have found no discrimination. And again, these are papers that have taken a cross-sectional look at wages, and amongst rookie wages, there's no difference at these positions, linebacker and tight end. And Ducking et al. They look at career earnings, and they don't find any differences in earnings between black and white players at these various positions. So the defensive line, linebackers, running back, tight end, and wide receivers. So what are we bringing to the party? Hopefully a more complete picture of wages over the careers of the NFL players by combining information from multiple data sets, and with a particular recognition of this survival process to free agency and how it might affect the estimation of wage gaps. Okay, so before I move on to the data, are there any questions? I'm aware I can't see the chat, but you'll tell me if there's any questions, James.
I will indeed. No questions that I need to stop you for at the moment.
Okie doke. So thinking about the data then, where does it come from? So the data on the invitees to the draft, that comes from profootballreference.com, and their performance in college comes from their sister site, which looks at college performance. So we try to tie these two things together. Performance in their career as an NFL player comes from NFL.com, but also Pro Football Reference has information on this as well. We've tried to find information on cognitive information. Say the quarterbacks who go through the draft, they are not required to, but a lot of them do take the Wonderlic test, which is essentially an IQ test. So we can have a look to see whether this signal of cognitive ability, whether that is relevant in the draft. In terms of identifying who is a white player and who is a black player, so we've had some help and some very significant help from Raphael's research assistants, Michael and Justin, who are both at the University of Toronto. And we've also supplemented our data from the US Census. So we've got information on the population density at the metro area for each franchise and how this has evolved over time. and also the ethnic makeup of those populations. So this is likely to reflect the ethnic makeup of the fan base. The wage data, that comes from spotrac.com. Okay, so onto the drafting sample. So we've got about 6,200 players here, 3,800 of them, 3,900 close to, make it. They get drafted, with the remaining not drafted. In terms of the people who get invited to the combine, we've got the majority of those people being invited are black, so it's about 4,100, and 1,600 white players being invited to the combine. You'll see in a moment how segregated by position this is, and so it'll be very obvious that there's quite a strong pre-draft selection process at work. We don't have information on how they performed at high school. I don't know of any data set that has information on high school football. If anybody does, then yeah, we're very interested to know about it. But information at college is the earliest that we can get. So we have 22% of quarterbacks in our sample are black, whereas at defensive cover positions, so these are players who play further back in the field, the safeties and the cornerbacks, 91% of those are black. So it's very clear that players are selecting into the position that they play before they get to the draft, and they're doing that. Well, that correlates very highly with their race. So I don't know if I highlight these, you can see them. So this is our full sample of players up here. So 6,000, and these are the different positions. So we've got the quarterback, we've got the offensive line, the defensive cover positions, the linebackers, the running backs, the wide receivers, and the special teams. And if we think about the percentage of players who are drafted, so of the players who are drafted, what percentage of those are white? So this is the people who are sort of the ethnic breakdown between white and black of the players that are successful. So overall, we have 71% of the people who are drafted are black, whereas about 25% of them are white. And so there's quite a big difference there overall. So most of the players who are drafted are black players. But at the quarterback position, we see the opposite picture. Yeah, so the vast majority of quarterbacks who are drafted are white. At other positions, some of them are split pretty much 50-50. So the offensive line is kind of pretty much split down the middle. But at other positions, there's sort of many more black running backs being successful in the draft, many more black wide receivers being successful in the draft. And as I said, yeah, almost all of the special teams, so the kickers and the punters, are white. So if we think about the difference between success and failure rates at the draft, we might get a glimpse into whether there's a different process going on for white and black players. So this row here, difference, this is the percentage differences that we've just seen between people who are successful, between white and black. So a 46 percentage point difference there in the success pool. And we can compare that to the unsuccessful, because there are many more black players in the draft. So there's going to be more both successful black players and also more unsuccessful black players. But we can compare the difference between the difference to get an idea of if there's any differences in the raw success versus failure rate. And it would seem that black players are more likely to be successful, accounting for the unequal numbers of black players going to the combine. Whereas at the quarterback position, white players are more likely to be successful. And although this number is quite high, 14 percentage points, it's saying in the other direction, 14 percentage points, you're going to get an indication of the difficulties we're going to have by showing that these results are robust, because we have so few black invitees at the quarterback position, even over an 18-year period, but even a 14 percentage points difference is not statistically significant here. We have some results that are significant. Black players much more successful at the wide receiver position. So yeah, race matters for position, and position certainly matters for your drafting success. There's also variation in drafting success by the positions themselves. So just being a quarterback, you're less likely to be drafted compared to being a linebacker. A higher percentage of linebackers end up being drafted. There are more positions open for that. And yeah, there are differences in the success versus failure rate for black and white players, but these are different depending on what position you're playing. So analyzing this by position is very, very important. Information on black management. So we've got information on white and black owners and coaches and GMs, general managers. So the flat line along the bottom here is representing the fact that there's no black owners in the league, and hasn't been for between 2000 and 2020. More interestingly is, or maybe that is interesting in and of itself, but more interestingly is the variation in the number of black coaches and black general managers over time. And these are raw numbers. So there are 32 NFL franchises. So we have in 2000, 3 out of 32 black coaches. This goes down a little bit. And then they introduced in 2003 something called the Rooney Rule, which required the shortlisting of at least one black candidate for the coach position initially. And then in 2009, they extend that to all senior operation positions, including general manager. So you can see the variation over time. Somewhat surprisingly, so you can rationalize why this goes up after 2002. You say, oh, well, more black coaches and more GMs are being interviewed. But it's quite hard to rationalize the drop in recent times. So we're almost back to where we started in terms of black GMs and black coaches in the league. In terms of metro area population, this is just represented from 2010. This gives an indication of, again, the variation in population areas. So we have some very densely populated areas, which we might think would draw a larger fan base. So like the New York teams are sharing a very large population. Somewhere like Green Bay is a very localized population. And there's significant variation in the percentage of black people in these areas as well. Have to note a little bit of an embarrassing data error with Cleveland. So Cleveland comes as a surprise to someone who's not from America. Apparently there's 2 places in America called Cleveland, and we had the wrong one for a while, so we need to fix that. The metro area population is right, but our percentage of black was wrong. So that will be fixed. But I literally spotted that a couple of days ago. Okay, so we want to think about the differences in drafting between black and white players, controlling for what we can observe. So there are statistically significant differences between black and white players in terms of their physicality. So the mean black player who gets invited to the draft is different from the mean white player in terms that they are shorter on average, they're lighter, they're faster, they can jump higher, they can jump longer, and they have less upper body strength. So they are they produce fewer bench reps in these tests that they do at the NFL Combine. So do the differences in drafting rates, do they persist once we control for the physical attributes of these invitees? And the answer is yes, they do. And they also do a whole bunch of other tests, but these are actually less relevant or less predictive of where they draft once you control for their height, their weight, and their speed. Control for these things, then you're getting a good sense of the physical signal that they've had from the combine. And yeah, so controlling for the physical signal, the differences that we have before, they remain. So black players doing better overall, and black players doing worse at the quarterback position. And this is a simple yes, no, do they draft or not? Did they make it or did they not? And these are marginal effects. So at quarterback, we're saying it's 12.6 percentage points less likely to be drafted if you're black. This is where they draft. So you want to draft as high as possible. The higher you draft, the better your wage in the league. So low numbers here are good. So you want to be as low as possible. So the fact that you draft 45 places higher if you're black is a bad thing. So that's like a round and a half later on in the draft do you get picked up on average. Again, controlling for these physical signals, and these are from a toe bit. What about the cognitive signal? Unfortunately, we only have the cognitive signal on the Wonderlic for quarterbacks, and black and white quarterbacks perform differently on this test, and they perform differently in a consistent way with the average in the US population. So they don't seem to be any different from the US population, these invitees. They're about one standard deviation lower on this test. When you control for that, the differences between black and white go away, albeit on a smaller sample of players. So, but nevertheless, this Wonderlic test does seem to be important in terms of whether you draft or not, and also where you draft. What about college statistics? So what about this signal of prior productivity? So if we think about how they've done in college, well, that's going to be a function of their physical and their cognitive skills. But it's also going to be a function of unobservables, of their intangibles, of their decision making, of their athletic ability. So that should show up in these stats. So if we're controlling for these stats, we should be controlling for these intangibles, albeit with a significant degree of measurement error, because there's a lot of things that make up how well you perform at college, and that will be including who you played with and where you played and who was your opposition. So within these stats, there is still quite a lot of noise. Yeah, who your coaches were, what the facilities were like. All that's going to be included in these performance statistics when we control for them. But controlling for their college performances is very predictive of whether they draft and where they draft. That's true both overall. So this variable here is something called productivity ranks. So this is how the player ranks in its relative category. So if you're a running back, it would be rushing productivity. If you're a quarterback, it would be yardage down the pitch productivity. And yeah, this really matters. So it matters for drafting, and it also matters for where you draft. Where you go to college also matters a lot. So if you're playing in a higher league at college, you're more likely to draft well. You've had more experience of playing very high pressured games. Do bear in mind that the college game in America is taken extremely seriously. It has an enormous fan base. You have, well, in non-COVID times, you have stadiums full of people, and you have it being played on telly as well. So yeah, the college game is really serious, particularly if you play at a major school, at a high-ranking college. What do we observe then when we're controlling for all these things? So we're controlling for our physical signal, our cognitive signal, and the productivity. Well, we have some evidence that black players still draft better overall in terms of whether they're likely to be drafted or not, but they're no worse at the quarterback position. With non-black and non-white players, we do see some differences remain. So again, non-black, non-white players less likely to be drafted, full stop. And when they are drafted, they're more likely to be drafted lower, and that's true overall, but also at the quarterback position. Bearing in mind, though, that our non-black, non-white players are a small number of relatively small number of observations in our sample. Okay then, so black players more likely to draft overall, and they're no worse at quarterback once we control for our observables. But there is some evidence that non-black and non-white players are not doing so well. Albeit the difference between being black, white, or non-black, non-white is much less important than doing well in college, as measured by a productivity ranking. So to save you looking at a whole load of tables, I've summarized some results from further tests that we've done. So tried interacting our productivity rank with the groups. There's no evidence of any interaction effects, so it's not the case that productivity matters more or less for black players or white players. Interestingly, there doesn't seem to be much going on with the coaches or general managers either. It doesn't seem to be the case that black general managers disproportionately draft more black players or draft their black players earlier. Also, interestingly, there doesn't seem to be much going on with the metro area population. So low black density metro area populations don't seem to attract fewer black players or coaches, in fact. And this is also consistent with early work by Goff and Tollison, who showed that while black coaches were more commonly found in high population density areas, the ethnic makeup of that area didn't seem to be so important. What about ex-post performances? So how well do these players then go on to perform in the NFL? Do the sort of the stereotypes, are they supported by how well they play out? And the raw differences, yes, they are. So overall, if you look at their performances as measured by what we would call approximate value, so this is a sort of an all-encompassing metric provided by sportingreference.com to assess the contribution of the player to the team's success. And if you look at the raw differences there between black and white players, they do match the positional stereotypes. So black players are performing better on average or on approximate value overall, but worse at quarterback. But then these differences in performances, they are accounted for by the observable information that we have at the point of draft. So once you add in the controls for the physical stats and the cognitive information, so how well they've done in college, then those differences go away. So it's not the case that the group average in terms of their skin color, it's not providing additional information that would be relevant at the point of selection. And nor do we see any evidence of discrimination reversal. So it's not the case in our data that the black quarterbacks, let's say, are outperforming the white quarterbacks in the league. What about wages then? So let's start to think about wages. I'm conscious of the time a little bit, but I think we're okay. So drafting really does matter for the wages that you get in the NFL. If you are drafted, you are almost certain to play a game. Not 100% certain to play a game, but you're 98% have a 98% chance of playing a game versus a 46% chance of playing a game if you are undrafted. So it's not the case that undrafted players just are always discarded. You've still got almost a 50% chance of having a career in the NFL. Actually, that's overstating it because those stats are just, the requirement is just to play one game. So it's getting signed to a team and playing a game. In terms of your wages, your rookie wages, they follow the draft pick order. I'll show you that in a moment. And there doesn't seem to be any white-black differences in earnings conditional upon your draft pick order at any positions. So this picture, I think, summarizes the case quite nicely. So you can see this very sharp drop in your first year cap hit. So this is the charge to the salary cap that the player is accounting for. So more money is better here. And the players at the top of the draft, they earn disproportionately more in their first year than players further on. It drops really, really sharply. until you get to about 100, and then it's sort of a slow, much slower decline thereafter. So drafting inside the first round is particularly vital, and high up in the first round is really crucial for your wages. And that's true whether you're a black player or whether you're a white player. This break here, I just put that in because this is something that was shown in Kiefer in 2016, and this is a small discontinuity at the first round. So there shouldn't really be much difference between the person who drafts number 32 and the person who drafts number 33. That difference should be marginal, if anything at all. But it is relevant because that's the end of the first round. So if you're number 33, you are a second round pick instead of a first round pick. And there does seem to be a small discontinuity there. In terms of career earnings, so this is earnings between, so this is the information from SpotRack on player earnings from 2011 to 2018. The key difference here is between what you earn in the first 4 years of your career and what you earn in the subsequent years of your career. So that red line is coming in between years 4 and 5, where you're moving away from your rookie contract into your free agency contract. And again, the story is the same. So whether you're black or whether you're white, what matters is making it to free agency, where you have this enormous uptick. Thereafter, your wages still do go up, whether you're a black or a white player. And this is a function of the better players surviving for longer in the league and being rewarded as such. So you can see these standard errors bars early on, they're very tight, and they get less tight as they go along. So we have a sample selection process going on here with the better players lasting longer in the league. In terms of the size of the error bars between black and white players, it's worth noting that, well, there are more black players, so the error bars are going to be shorter. But actually also, if you look at the variance in wages between white players, they are also larger. So that's also accounting for the larger error bars there. But yeah, the take-home message here is making it to free agency is vital for your career earnings as an NFL player. Yes, there is also some small indication of a pre-negotiation bump for white players that doesn't seem to be quite as apparent for black players. So if you look at the difference between 3 and 4, yes, it goes up a little bit here for black players, but it seems to be going up quite a bit more for white players. So is there anything to be said about that? At this stage, I'm not sure, because this could equally be a quarterback effect rather than a white effect per se, because we know in that there are more quarterbacks who are white, and quarterbacks on average are going to have more bargaining power even in their rookie years. So the real superstars, even if they're on this restrictive contract at that moment in time, because they know they're going to be a superstar, and the franchise knows that they're going to be a superstar and somebody that they're going to want to keep further down the line, quarterbacks can on occasion renegotiate their rookie contract early. And the best example of this is Patrick Mahomes, who's done this a year early and is now the highest paid player in the league because he's an absolute superstar. So survival to create free agency is crucial. 65% of rookies, they don't make it. We've seen this large uptick, and I'm arguing that this is going to be important for the ex-ante option value, because even if we observe equal wages, if the prospect of making it to free agency is different for white and black players, then the ex-ante option value will be unequal. And remember the evidence in Volts from 2017 in the Journal of Sports Economics. There it's shown quite convincingly that black quarterbacks do get benched more often, are more likely, all else being equal, than white quarterbacks over the course of a season. So we have quite strong priors to believe that there may be unequal treatment in terms of survival between white and black players. What do we see in our data? We see survival rates being marginally better at non-quarterback positions for black players, albeit they're not robust once we control for the things that we can control for. We do see survival rates significantly higher for white players, even controlling for the things that we can control for. So if I was going to put my money on one result holding up out of this data as being robust, it would be the difference in survival rates between white and black players. And it's particularly noticeable among the very small group of quarterbacks who have what we call a long career of 10 years plus. So 16% of white quarterbacks make it over 10 years, as opposed to only 2.5% of black quarterbacks in our sample. This just is a Cox regression, which is saying what I've just said. So blacks doing slightly better overall, but at the quarterback position doing worse. So these are exit likelihoods, so higher numbers here are bad. This does need further verification. We need to think more carefully about the different types of exit, and in particular, we have data on injuries to players, and these exits are not going to be due to a differential treatment process between black and white quarterbacks. They're going to be more random than that. So we need to match these injuries into our data and account for maybe competing risks survival model here. So that remains to be done. The trouble with that is matching in the injuries to our data set is not straightforward. But yeah, in theory it is possible, and it's something that we need to work on. Okay, so what about these approximate option values? So if you take our numbers at face value, the numbers that we have for this difference between white and black quarterbacks in terms of their survival probability, we have a difference of 6 percentage points in terms of making it to free agency. So if you take a very rough look at the median of the distribution, or the mean of the distribution, that amounts to a $3 million difference in the for their first free agency contract, the contract after their fourth year that they sign. Definitely should have some caveats here, though, that within that, how representative of the population is the mean when we're talking about quarterbacks, because there is an enormous amount of variation in quarterback wages. The superstars, they can earn $50-60 million a year, and the non-superstar quarterbacks who can still have a long career, they can be on sort of 1 million a year. So there is an enormous variation in quarterback wages. There's also significant wage inflation over our sample period. So the salary cap year on year has been increasing, and that salary cap is tied to the revenue increase in the NFL. So as the NFL revenues from media rights have gone higher and higher and higher, so has the salary cap, which has allowed higher and higher wages being able to be paid to quarterbacks in our sample. And potentially we also have a higher concentration of black quarterbacks later on in the sample. So we might need to caveat these rough calculations with those things, with those features. We also might have differences in the underlying hazard. So in our Cox model, you're assuming a proportional hazards. So regardless of where you are in your career, the difference between black and white is assumed to be having an equal effect at any point in time. And that might not be the case. So we might need a more sophisticated parametric model to really pin down what the differences are between black and white quarterbacks in terms of survival. Okay, so I think I'm getting there. So to sum up, I think what we're claiming is that there's clear differences in terms of how white and black players select into their position, and that this is going on before even they get to college. Controlling for what we can control for, we don't believe that there are robust differences between white and black players at the moment of the draft. There doesn't seem to be very much differences in the way that black coaches or black general managers operate, or the difference between highly dense black areas and highly dense white areas. Doesn't seem to be much difference between white and black wages, conditional on observables, but there is a very big difference between being a rookie and being a veteran, and making it to being a veteran seems to be critical. And the thing that we want to really focus in on is whether there's going to be differences in survival for career earnings, and I think that's what we're going to be focusing our attention on in the near future. So thank you very much for listening very patiently. But yeah, I'd be very happy to take questions, and even happier to pass them off to my co-authors.
Well, they're both here. So thank you very much, Ian. Really interesting talk, and very well explained to those not so familiar with the NFL that may be here. Does anybody have any questions or comments? I should say that while we wait for hands to be raised, Peter Group just put a couple of references you might want to cite in the chat. Now, I'm aware you might not be able to see that, so if
no, I can't,
I will then I'll copy and paste those and send them over to you.
Great, thank you.
No hands have been raised yet. Nope, they have. I've been corrected. But my computer is slow. Stefan, there we go.
Hi, Ian. That was very interesting, good fun. Just to add to your work, I mean, this is you may want to think about this or not, but one thing you mentioned, the significance of college in this, and obviously that is very important. You might I'm not sure this has been done, perhaps it has, but you might want to think about where the college the players come from, and in particular, you might want to look at the academic standing of the college. So, me being at Michigan, we used to be the great powerhouse of college football, and frankly, we've been crap for the last couple of decades. And we will die in a ditch to support the claim that that's because we have higher academic standards. We actually enforce them. We make our students go to classes and pass their exams, and I can speak from personal experience of disciplining athletes who have tried to skip classes. We really do that, and it may just be a northern bias and anti-southern bias here, but we definitely, there's a feeling that these academic rules are not being enforced so stringently. So that might have an effect on the ability of players to progress in the NFL. And because, of course, there are big racial differences by region, that might actually then interact with some of the race effects that you're looking at.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I did take a look at academic requirement entries. So I do have some data on that, and it's in two forms. So one is the average entry requirements of the college that they attend, and then there's also another paper that has tried to work out what the average qualifications of people who actually have a sports scholarship at that college are. And it won't shock you to know that they are substantially lower. But putting in either of those into an equation that's trying to predict where people draft doesn't seem to have an effect on anything in terms of their likelihood of drafting or where they draft. What I don't have is sort of individual level information on their academic performances. So I don't have player X's grades, their grade profile. We just have the average in the college. So I guess the average in the college is maybe a fairly blunt indicator of how this particular player is going to perform in the draft. But yeah.
Yeah, it's also complicated by the fact that, I mean, certainly you'd never be able to get hold of the athlete's grades. But I mean, One thing is there's also evidence. There's some papers showing that our recruitment of students improves when our football team's doing better. So
yes, I've heard that. Yeah,
more applicants and higher quality applicants when we win football games.
Yeah, that's obviously very bad news for Sheffield because both our sides just got relegated. So one from the Premier League and one from the Championship. So yeah, I fear you're right. So I'm not looking forward to next year's entry.
Okay, thanks, Stefan. Thanks, Ian. Next is Peter.
I have a couple of questions. Are you only looking at people who have completed careers, or how are you dealing with the right censored data? People who have ongoing careers?
Yeah, so in the Cox regression, they're censored. Yeah, so yeah, that's just taken into account in the Cox regression. In the wage equations, you have information on the players' future earnings. So we have information on people who have signed their contract, let's say in 2018, and we have a projection of what they can earn in 2019, 2020, 21, 22. But beyond that, in the wage equations, we haven't done anything explicitly to control for right censoring. But yeah, maybe it's something we need to think about more in the wage equations. Yeah.
I know that Dan Black and Mark Berger have a paper years ago that does a good job of dealing with right and left censored for exit discrimination. I have a paper, I think, on the NBA. Well, actually, I think the one I just put up here to the side uses that technique in for exit discrimination in the NFL. But it's not for quarterbacks. It's for defensive players and offensive players. So you might want to look at that as a technique to control for that.
Yeah, I'll certainly do that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think your biggest problem is the majority of African American players, quarterbacks, are now currently playing. You don't have that many careers that have ended.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
well, I mean, we do have black quarterbacks' careers who have ended in the
That's true. That's true. It's not a big
right. The new wave,
right.
Yeah, and they're really, these are the best. Like Aaron Rodgers aside,
yeah,
they are the best quarterbacks in the league, right? So
yes,
yeah,
so
and on very good money.
That's the one thing I think you need to control for.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's helpful.
Rosie, where's your water bottle?
Okay, thanks, Peter. Then we'll go to a couple of questions in the chat before going to Dennis. So first of all, Matthew asks, is it possible to recruit outside the draft?
Yes.
Follow on is, he says, well, he asks because in English football, if you're soccer, you're in the top division, you can always recruit from abroad, but presumably there isn't much recruiting from abroad going on.
There's almost no recruitment from abroad. There are occasional exceptions. So the NFL has had a program to support British young players to come and try out for American teams, but the success rate is phenomenally low. However, you can be undrafted and end up having a career. So as I go back, it was so drafting is really important. It's 98% versus 46%, but 46% of players who 46% of players who fail in the draft still end up playing at least one game. What percentage of those then go on actually have a proper career, I guess, is quite small. But no, you can be undrafted and still make it. Players do go undrafted and then make the roster at a later date.
Okay, thanks. And then Sarah says that she knows absolutely nothing about NFL, but she was interested by the fact that black players were less common in certain notable positions and wonders how that compares to other sports like rugby union.
I've no idea about rugby union. Honestly, I don't. Or other sports. I think I was surprised by how stark it was, but there must be something going on at an early stage in the decisions that these players are making. And I think it may even be happening like early on in high school. Yeah. Maybe things will change in the future. So now young kids can see Patrick Mahomes chucking the ball like 80 yards down the pitch and being an absolute boss on the football field, and things might change. But yeah, it is incredible that there are no white cornerbacks at all, not even one. And yeah, until very recently, black quarterbacks were very rare. And still, yeah, in the punting and kicking, there's no black punters or kickers. So yeah, it is amazing. How it compares to other sports, I don't know.
I can pipe in, Ian.
Go ahead.
I can pipe in with one. Baseball is the equivalent one. Pitching. Pitchers have historically been white in baseball, even as baseball has had a lower proportion of black players than NFL. But it's if you look at pitching and quarterbacking, you find a similar distinction.
Thanks, Raphael. Next, we've got Dennis. At least I hope we have. Dennis, you there?
Yeah, I clicked on the camera instead of the microphone. So I penalized you by making you see me, but not making you hear me. So a couple of things. The first is, if you're interested in academic performance of the players, individual performance you won't be able to get, but you should be able to get figures for progress towards graduation of the institutions. And they have to make those kind of reports. They may be kind of fudged numbers, but they do have to provide that kind of information, 5-year graduation rates and academic progress reports on an annual basis. So that might be a way of addressing sort of the difference in academic requirements to some extent. The other thing that occurred to me is, well, I'll come back to that in a second. Just as an aside, there's a very famous black punter, though he probably retired before your data. I think his last name was Roby. Can't think of his first name at the time. But he was quite unusual. So that it has happened, but it's not very common.
Okay. What was his name?
Rob something Roby, R-O-B-Y. I can't come up with his first name right now. The other thing that occurs to me is it's not clear why there is such. It's not clear to me how you distinguish between what is mandated by the rules. You mentioned this setup where they have this slotting system that says, if you're drafted here, this is what your pay is relative if you're drafted there. Yeah. And, it basically is through the first round. And then after the first round, I think the slotting system dies. I'm not positive about it, but I'm pretty sure it applies just to the first round. And
so it's a collective agreement.
Yeah, from the collective bargaining agreement. So I'm not sure how that plays into the distinction that you're drawing about the earnings over the careers. Simply because they're limited in this way by where they're drafted and how that persists throughout the length of their career.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the point I'm trying to make, that for those first 4 years, your wages are mechanically tied to this collective bargaining agreement that the players' union has negotiated with the franchise owners that pretty much sets out what the number 1 draft gets, what the number 2 gets, etc. I mean, there's some variation, but it's not much within that. And so, yeah, so that's why you see that very, very clear correlation between the draft order and the wages. After that, in your free agency, that's it. It's completely open. You can negotiate whatever you're able to get in the market. So that is the big difference in how wages are determined in the league. In the first 4 years of your contract, it's almost mechanically determined according to where you draft. When you become a free agent, it's just the market rate for your individual skills and ability, and there the variation is enormous. But in any respect, we don't see in the observed distribution of wages, or in either of those 2 periods, differences between black and white players once you control for what you can observe.
Yeah, I guess what I'm wondering is, so if you think about Stan Huang and Cameron and can't think of Cameron's co-author, where they, and I think Dave Barry has something along these lines as well, that shows that many years into your career, where you were drafted by an NBA franchise still influences your playing time. And I don't know that anybody has looked at that in terms of pay, but it seems like it must matter. And so I wonder if in this context, if where you were drafted even influences how much you can negotiate for later on. And I understand it's a free market system and you can get whatever the best deal is. I'd just be curious to know if in fact it persists. If I was drafted in the 3rd round and turn out to be a superstar, do I still get a lower salary than an equivalent player that was drafted in the 1st round?
Yeah, so I have got some wage equations with that in, and the answer is that it does matter. So where you draft does matter. But that is because it's a signal of their ability. So the players who draft higher are on average just better and perform better in the league. And so once you control for the stats on how they've actually performed in the league, then that is what is explaining the correlation between where they draft and their earnings in their free agency period. Do you see what I mean? There's not an additional prestige factor of being the number 2 draft pick. If you've sucked for 4 years, you're out. It doesn't matter.
So
Yeah.
but it does influence playing time.
That will be probably true. Yes. You will have a better chance early on than somebody who's undrafted for sure. Yeah, you'll be given the opportunity. Yeah.
But I wonder if post free agency, because that's kind of what the Stan Huang for the NBA shows.
Okay. I'll certainly look at it. Yeah, it's definitely something to think carefully about. Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks, Dennis. Peter has added another reference that you can't see in the chat, Ian, which apparently shows that African American quarterbacks tend to become cornerbacks in college. So again, I'll get that over to you in email so that you can look at that. And then Alex asks, do franchise tagged players matter in this work at that point where your wages go up?
Yeah, the franchise tag is awkward because your wages go up and you remain restricted to the franchise that has put the tag on you. So it's a signal that you've done well and that they're willing to pay for you, and they have to pay you more under certain rules, but you can't go and get your full free agency market rate. I haven't identified who's got a franchise tag on them in a particular year, so that's in the noise at the moment. But yeah, it's potentially relevant and maybe something we have to think about how to identify. Because maybe it's not that hard to go through the data and pick them out, because there won't be that many. It should just be one per franchise, right? In each year. Yeah. So maybe we can go and just manually pick them out, the franchise tags.
Okay. And then Alex has got his hand up.
Yeah, thanks, James. So, Ian, just to get to the nub of what we're trying to do, in this making it to free agency model, are there any race interactions that show up in what you've currently got? I've got an impression of a model which has a bunch of sort of baseline statistics, like where you were in the draft, but less in terms of time varying covariates, because we had in our head, didn't we, ideas such as the extent to which somebody who flunks in a couple of games gets a second chance.
Yeah.
And that requires some time varying covariates from game time and stuff, doesn't it?
Yeah, so we do have those. And yeah, it's just a question of trying to be quite careful in the estimating equation and putting those in. But yeah, we have time varying information on game time and things like that in the data that we can use to try to sort of pull out those effects.
I guess then
it may well be the case that one of the things that is explaining these overall differences in survival rates between black and white quarterbacks is, as you say, the white quarterback gets a second chance when the black player maybe does not, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And there's evidence in vaults to suggest that that is kind of going on too. So yeah.
Right. Is that your sort of primary suspect at the moment?
I think so. Yeah.
Right.
So yeah. Elsewhere, I think things look fairly kosher, but it's the difference in survival rates in the sample of players that we have that I would be most concerned about. Yeah.
And it's curious seeing these sort of general pattern of results you gave today, sort of flatlining stuff around who the complexion of the customers who attend, and I wasn't
Yeah,
clear
I was slightly
any strong
maybe
view
it's a good
about
thing,
the
but
coaches either.
yeah, no, I was going to say I was slightly disappointed that I didn't find anything, but then I have to remind myself that well, actually, maybe it's a good thing if people are being treated equally. So yeah, good for people, but maybe bad for econometricians.
There's something exciting to think about as regards the racial complexion of the teams that the players play for. Admittedly, when it comes to coaches, you don't have a huge amount of black decision makers in there, but you do have some, and there is some time variance. And I'm very curious to know whether decisions are made which ultimately prove to the detriment of black quarterbacks, and the extent to which that in any way does or does not reflect the racial complexion of the decision makers who choose the players who go out to play, because that might give us some really nice insights into the nature of stereotypes versus different types of racial discrimination.
Yeah, so that remains to be done. My guess would be that it's going to be hard to pinpoint a robust effect because of the small numbers. Yeah.
I can tell you, by the way, coming back to as the English football, soccer, we've done all that analysis, me and Arnaud Chevalier, on playing time that footballers get on the pitch. Mm-hmm. No racial differences, but there are small differences in the racial complexion of English Premier League players by race, and whether they're a forward or a midfielder or a fullback.
Yeah.
But nothing like what you're observing.
Yeah, not to the same extent, right? Yeah.
Thanks, Alex. And we're getting a little insight into this collaboration because Raphael has got his hand up to ask the next question.
This is our chance to do some co-author brainstorming.
Yeah.
So no, I had one thought, which is the one group that does seem to cohere with our priors going into this research was the non-black, non-white group. They do seem to be the ones that are punished, given how many things we do control for. Their racial composition does seem to matter. So I was wondering if you could talk a little more about that group and how sizable is it in some of those estimates, and whether that's the...
Well, this is it. So overall, where's the sample? Go back. So there's 445 out of 6,200 non-white and non-black players, and those are spread over the several positions. So once we break it down by position, you're looking at just a handful, sometimes not even double digits. In those positions. So we're asking a lot of a very small number of observations by position. And that's over an 18-year period. I mean, so it's a long period of time, and yet we're only observing the very small numbers here. So I guess that's why I didn't make more of that in the presentation. But the numbers are there in the data, so it does seem to be something. But
the effects are so
much
big.
Weight you put on it, I think.
But Ian, the effects are so big in some cases that, despite the standard errors, they're still significant.
They are. That's it. The effects are large.
Yeah.
Even for these small number of people. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Raphael. We've got some questions stacking up now. I've got Dennis first, then Stefan.
Thinking about the non-white, non-black players, I had two questions related to that. One is, are these 445 individuals, or are they player years? So it's the same person multiple times?
No, it's an individual.
It's an individual.
Yeah.
Okay. That actually is kind of surprising to me. And I wonder if amongst that 445, how many of them you could identify as Pacific Islanders, because
the majority.
The majority are Pacific Islanders.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. Stefan.
Yeah, I was just coming back to the comments you're making about decision making in this, and thinking about the role of the owners. Obviously, the owners play a huge role in determining the policies of the team. And I mean, your data runs through the Trump presidency, okay? And Trump inserted himself into the NFL in major ways over the period. And it might be worth thinking a little bit about that. Particularly, they often talk in the NFL about the face of the franchise, the one player who represents the franchise. And you could see how, even if there's perhaps not, you might think of there being decision making here on the basis of athletic ability, but also decisions here being made on the basis of a wider appeal to, celebrity appeal to the general public. And the NFL fans are, said to be, very, to lean heavily Republican. And that might well mean that they would rather have a white face representing the franchise than a black face, and that could, could all come down to something like that. So, I mean, that's probably something you want to think about, certainly discuss in terms of something as specific as the quarterback, because they are a relatively small number of them in the total number of players, right? So you're talking about a very specialist position to begin with.
Yeah, that's right. So this that is what that early paper showed long before Trump was around. I try not to think about Trump because it just makes me lose my mind. But so the Kahn paper, that was that idea that it's customer-led discrimination that that you have a predominantly white fan base having a preference for a white quarterback in particular and being willing to pay for that. I mean, we could certainly try to think more along those lines and do some further tests.
Well, you could think about sort of social media metrics for some of these players. That would be one way to get at whether there are, whether they have more followers or, I don't know how far back you can collect that kind of social media data these days, but certainly for the current players, that would be relatively easy to do.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. And with just a couple of minutes left, I think it's probably a good point to wrap up proceedings and say another thank you to Ian for a very, very interesting talk on racial discrimination in the NFL. Yep, we've got some applause. People making use of the fantastic tools that Teams allows us in this virtual age. Speaking of the virtual age, I shall again plug next Friday's event that's being organised by Robbie Butler at the University College Cork. If my computer allows me in the very short space of time that we've got, I shall try and put the program schedule up. We'll see if we can get there. So that's the schedule for next Friday, beginning at 9:30, running through to 11:55. As I said, some fantastic papers there. Rob Simmons, Pamela Vicker, Enya Herdeguden, and Declan Jordan, and myself. So please do get in touch with Robbie Butler if you're interested in that. We'll return as well next Friday with David Boto Garcia, who is presenting managerial beliefs and firm performance, field evidence from professional elite soccer. So on that note, thank you very much, everybody, and very much look forward to seeing you again next week. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, James.
Cheers, Ian. I'm just going to turn off the recording. It doesn't let me. Stop presenting and then I'll turn it off.
Have I stopped presenting? I thought I had.
No, that wasn't an instruction. That was me
clicking
on my computer. Not usually quite as forthright as that. Oh, here we go.
Great.
My
Are you going running?
I will be. No, I've done that for today. When it's a Rose's day, usually what I do is I